So we know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Just really briefly, we know that CO2 concentrations are rising. This is the famous Keeling curve that since 1958, when we've measured CO2 directly, we've seen distinct rises in CO2. If we want to look back further, we have to use ice cores. So this shows the acceleration of CO2 content in the atmosphere after the Industrial Revolution. And looking back even further in ice cores, we can see the context of the recent rises compared to the last million years. And so over the last million years, CO2 was never higher than 300 parts per million. We're at about 388 parts per million now, and then depending on a lot of economic uncertainty, we'll be up in the 700 parts per million range by the end of the 21st century. So this is kind of a building block approach. We know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We know that humans are increasing CO2 concentration. So we should be able to measure the actual greenhouse effect of CO2 in the atmosphere. And in fact, we can do that. So this is a paper called Radiative Forcing Measured at Earth's Surface Corroborate the Increasing Greenhouse Effect. So what they're doing, this is just a typical kind of diagram of the Earth's energy budget. And what they're doing is they're measuring the increased downward long-wave radiation right here. So they're showing an increase in that, and they say the resulting uniform increase of long-wave downward radiation manifests radiative forcing that is induced by increased greenhouse gas concentrations in water vapor feedback, and proves the theory of greenhouse warming with direct observations. So if there's more shortwave radiation coming down towards the Earth from the atmosphere, it stands to reason that we should be seeing less outgoing radiation as well. And that is what we see, and we can measure that from satellites. So this paper is called Increases in Greenhouse Forcing Inferred from the Outgoing Long-Wave Radiation Spectra of the Earth in 1970 and 1997. And what they show is this increase in outgoing long-wave radiation. And they say, our results provide direct experimental evidence for a significant increase in the Earth's greenhouse effect that is consistent with concerns over radiative forcing of climate. The other way that we can look at how humans are influencing climate is by running climate models. This is a composite of a bunch of climate model runs. These individual climate model runs are in yellow here, and the red is the average of all the climate model runs. And then this black line is the actual observed temperature. What you can see is that throughout the 20th century, if we put human influence and natural influence together, that climate models do a pretty good job actually of reproducing the globally average surface temperature. However, when we don't put in increasing greenhouse gas concentrations from humans, climate models cannot reproduce the warming that we've seen in the second half of the 20th century. So this is basically saying that we know of no natural way for this warming to have occurred. So just kind of summarizing that, we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We know the rise in airborne CO2 is from fossil fuel burning. We can measure the increase in the greenhouse effect. We can measure the increase in temperature. We know of no natural phenomenon that can account for the observed changes. Okay, so moving on to the Climate Research Unit emails, or ClimateGate. This is just a headline, one of hundreds that kind of talked about how these emails kind of throw into question the entire science of global warming. Just a quick background of what happened. This took place in November 2009. Servers at the University of East Anglia were illegally hacked. Thousands of private emails going back to 1996 were published on the internet. Of those thousands of emails, a handful of quotes were pulled out and used as evidence of a kind of scientific conspiracy going on. So I'm just going to focus on the one quote that's really gotten the most attention. And so in this quote, Phil Jones, who's actually the director of the Climate Research Unit, says, I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temps to each series for the last 20 years, i.e. from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keys to hide the decline. And Mike here is referring to Michael Mann, who's at Penn State, and Nature, they're talking about the journal Nature. So this is kind of me paraphrasing, but as far as my interpretation, it seemed like a lot of media outlets, commentators, pundits, kind of translated this quote as global temperatures are falling, so I'm going to use a trick to fool people into thinking that they are rising. Now this is kind of an extraordinary claim to say that one guy or one group of scientists could fool the entire scientific community and fool the world into thinking that temperatures are rising when they are really falling. And of course that's not what was going on. The decline here is actually referring to an issue with tree ring data. Scientists use other means other than thermometers to measure temperature, thousands of years ago, because of course there were no thermometers. And one of those ways to measure temperatures is by using tree ring data. And there's actually a whole field in climate science dedicated to this called dendroclimatology. And so this is a paper published by Phil Jones, is one of the authors. So the point is that the decline that we've seen in tree ring data was not actually hidden at all, but was published on. And so the paper is called Tree Rings Tell of Past Climates, but Are They Speaking Less Clearly Today? And so this decline is referring to the decline in the correlation between the observed temperature and tree ring proxies of temperature. And so they show good agreement back when the instrument records started, and then past about 1960 they diverge, and this is known as the divergence problem. And so what was actually happening here, what this quote is referring to, this is the actual graph from the Michael Mann paper. And what they did was that they used reconstructed temperature data from tree rings up to 1960, and then they added in the actual data because they said, we're a lot more sure of the actual data. We're not so sure of this tree ring data, why this divergence is occurring. And so they just plotted the end of the graph with actual data. I think it's reasonable to say that in the interest of full disclosure, they shouldn't have constructed the graph this way. I think it's reasonable to say, hey, they should have, kept the tree ring data, and it would just have kind of gone like this at the very end of the graph. But the idea that this, throws into question the entirety of climate science is really just kind of